30 seconds. Counting.
Was that film 30 seconds to comply?
You will comply. You are part of the collective.
Gavin. That's Gavin, is it? Right. Gee. Daryl. Good morning, everyone. And we are quorate, which is good news. And we have Ellen and Gavin on Teams, I believe. Yes, your roundels are there.
Yeah, I'm here, Chair.
Thank you. Waiting for someone to sit down. Oh. We got a thumbs up from Gavin. That's good. I think we have someone else walking in. To join us. Right. Well, welcome everybody. Gemma, do we have any apologies for absence?
We haven't received any apologies for absence.
Thank you. Are there any declarations of pecuniary or other interests associated with this agenda? That's good. Apart from we all hope to get our houses insulated at some point. Right. Chairman's remarks. Just 2 points. Firstly, our brownfield site recommendations were accepted by the board, and I'm told that most of them have been implemented. So already, so I think that's probably good news. In terms of next year's work programme, I think historically it's been the case of the chairman and the vice chairman have had discussions with officers, and then there's been a circulation of ideas. I think this committee works particularly well as a team, and I think it's worthwhile us getting together. I think we're going to do that on Teams, aren't we? Yes, we'll get together on Teams because we're quite good at idea building, and I don't see why the agenda should be predominantly mine and Vera's. I think it's just better. I think it's better if we all participate. And email is not a good way of generating ideas, I think. No. Right, we've got 2 sets of minutes of the 20th of January. Has anybody got any comments? I don't intend going through them page by page. They're okay, are they? Right, so we'll take those as okay. And minutes of the 27th of January, which was the mayoral budget session, which is partly us and partly the transport scrutiny committee. Is everybody comfortable with those? Good morning.
Morning.
That's all right.
Apologise for my loudness.
Sorry about it. We're glad you're here. You never miss. So minutes of the 27th. Everybody comfortable with those? Yeah. Has anybody got any matters arising from those minutes that aren't on the agenda that need to be brought up? Okay, so we'll move on to our first substantive item C. I think that is you. A very interesting report which you'll take us through. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. So the West Midlands Gate Region report is effectively, you can see a very high-level annual summary that meant to provide that annual review of the conditions of the West Midlands. It's intended to provide that context so that we can better understand the overall performance of the West Midlands. It's not a report of the performance of, let's say, the combined authority or of our local authority. It's very much, actually, if we want to read one report to understand how things are in the region, we wanted this report to be that report that you can read and understand and pick up and just understand how things are going in the West Midlands. In the report, there's a exec summary where we summarize these are the things that are happening here, and then these are the opportunities or challenges that are currently being faced. And effectively, the hope and ask of the overview and scrutiny committee is for you to hopefully consider what some of those key messages say, what the recommendations of the report are going to say. You might wish to consider, are there things emerging from the report where you want to discuss in overview scrutiny? Or are there things that you wish the WMCA board to consider and that you wish to raise for them, really? You see that the report is going to set up according to the fundamentals of inclusive growth, so that signed off by the WMCA board back in 2018 about how in the way that we want to grow our economy in the West Midlands, it's not just by how aggressive the economy grows, but actually the extent to which that growth is then being shared across our people and place, and in a way that makes sure that it realizes that environmental outcomes and social outcomes for our residents and communities right across every town and city in the West Midlands as well. So that, I think that I'll leave it at the moment, but happy to take any questions or comments about the report. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the report. I was quite interested on this section, I think it's 3.2, where it's talking about the climate and the environment there. And it comes across that it's very rosy about emission levels falling, etc., and things like that. But I understood that, well, first of all, we talk about CO2, but I was under the impression things have moved on slightly a bit, that whilst there's CO2, there's other particulates. I think there's 900 deaths a year or something that's meant to be due to poor air quality. And I think a lot of that is I'm not an expert in the area, nitrates or something that comes from diesel engines and things like that. That's the thing that causing the problems, not the CO2. And it seems a very rosy picture, but Birmingham have just recently put in this clean air zone. I understand that was because of an opposite case where they said that emission rates were rising. Obviously, then produced a survey saying that they'd fallen dramatically because of the clean air zone. Nicely done during COVID when no one was driving into Birmingham. So, but that was it. And I understand that the rates have gone back up again since people have started travelling back into the office, etc. And so I was a bit confused about the statement on that level. And the second thing is, how are we getting those levels? Because I've got concerns myself about the positioning of some of these monitoring stations. They look very, you know, they're not where I would put them if I really wanted to know what was really going on, and how often are these monitoring stations checked. So I just read that statement and I just thought I probably need to ask a few more questions about that, because I could go through the report, but I just thought I'd pick out that one item. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. So you're absolutely right that emissions declined up in 2020 when everyone's working from home, COVID, in the middle of COVID and so forth. And when we reported last year, an increase from in CO2 emissions from 4.4 back up to 4.7, which is still in 2021, which is still the lowest since if we look back to 2013 when it was 6.7. The good news is that in 2022 it then dropped back down to 4.4, so it's still a downward trend that in a way it's continued the right trajectory, but we are not on track. We are off track to meet net zero by 2041, which was what as I understand it, the West Midlands committed to a few years prior, really. So it's downward, it's off track, it's not exactly it's not where we need it to be, really, ultimately. I don't know if actually my colleagues might have some best knowledge of how this is calculated. I can think to Coventry and somewhere on those senses do vary, and my understanding there are different types of sensors in place. You've got the ones which are kind of manually collected tubes that are read at a much more irregular basis as opposed to the automated ones, which are much more frequent. But I do want to remember that my colleagues might say one.
Do any of the officers know? This might be something we might want to put on our work programme, to actually have some work done on it. And that is part of the purpose of this paper, is to spark in our minds things that we might be interested in. So, but do come back.
Yeah, I think I just completely agree with you. I mean, I think A, thank you for the report, and B, I think that's what we're here to do, isn't it? We're here to be critical friend, asking how do we get these numbers and how relevant are they to do whatever. So I love what the intention is, and just want to make sure that we get there in a meaningful manner, and we don't just pick out one stat about we've got a monitoring station in the middle of some park and wow, look at how good it is, and really, you know, you're standing in the middle of the motorway and everyone's choking to death. You know what I mean? Thanks very much.
I've got three speakers now, Councillor Baton, followed by Councillor Kettle, and then Councillor Benton. Councillor Baton.
Thank you, Chair. So I think my overall conclusion when reading the report is that the variations are regionally are big, and nationally we are not doing very easily. And I think that came out loud and clear. I mean, you know, health and wellbeing, life expectancy, we're down on that. Education and learning, power and participation, inclusive growth. We lag behind the national average on all of those, which has to be a major concern for the inclusive growth for this region. So I suppose it's an eye to that. And whilst, you know, I know that the kind of the funding streams that are coming in and some progress has been made, I would suggest not enough progress has been made, and in fact maintaining the focus going forward. You know, when we talk about connecting communities, and efforts must be made to ensure connectivity is inclusive. You know, I can quote from Dudley Council's figures that approximately 20% of residents in Dudley are digitally excluded. Now, if 20% of those residents are digitally excluded, not only does it disadvantage them in terms of being able to participate, but it also disadvantages them in terms of the jobs market. So I think it's really making sure that the work of the CA is really has a hyper focus on these areas where we are completely lagging behind. And when I look at the 3.9 on equality, and that demonstrates a huge regional disparity as well. So I suppose again it's having an eye on future work programmes and having how we pick out then how we want those reports back in more detail to give us the assurances that actually the authority is working in the right way to make sure that those strands are being reduced. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Kettle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two aspects of what we've just been talking about, and that's the troubling figures where it leads to concern, where people are not in education or employment, and three of our authorities that are part of the CA have got figures that are double the national average, which is what a huge failure to our young people, what a huge waste to our young people. The formative years when they leave school to the 30s, if they're not used in education and employment, and they don't build up the skill base and knowledge base in their lifestyle, we lose so much, and we've got to concentrate on identifying these people and getting them economically active within our system one way or another. That's one aspect I'd like to raise. That Wolverhampton, Walsall and Birmingham have double the average, the national average of needs. I think it's something like 900,000 people who are walking around doing nothing, and it's what a waste that's really affecting our population. The other one is we had a report about 10 days ago where DEFRA had withdrawn the funding for monitoring of clean air. All the funding had gone. And we had a report, and we got 5 internally of monitors that were showing radical problems with air quality. One of which broke my heart. It was the ring road in Stourbridge, which is not far away from where I live. And what I'm getting at is clean air does affect people's health, especially in congested areas, in cities and far more so in the inner conurbation. But wherever we've got poor quality air, I think it's got to be mined, it's got to be sorted out. And this one has got to be found from somewhere. Because although people who are doing us the favour of having electric vehicles are already having an impact, and working from home is having quite an impact, things aren't quite back to normal. But we really need to not overlook the fact that the health problems created by poor air quality affects everyone. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for that. I'm actually taking notes of these of potential issues we want to investigate in. So both you and Councillor Baton have, in essence, Councillor McKee have raised in essence the same issue on that last one. Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of things that I pulled out of the report. Do you want me to do them all at the same time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you could do them one at a time, if you want a response. Otherwise, you can. If it's just general comments, you can do them in a row.
I want a response to a few things, Chair, because I saw within the demographics there was a mention of the population rise, but there wasn't a mention of any micro sort of migration or macro migration or birth rate. And so I'd be more interested to understand how the population's growing. I think it's easier to make recommendations if you know how we're getting more people into the area. So we know there's more people here, but where did they come from? Does that make sense, Chair?
It absolutely does make a lot of sense. See, can you provide any insight on that?
I'll need to go back and make sure we put those figures in, but this is a really important point that we'll take forward, because this is a draft report, so we'll make sure it's in the next in the final report, which we can show yourselves as well.
Thank you, See. Ellen, your next point.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Well, this builds on from that point, as you'd expect from me, Chair, because we've then know that we've got a problem with housing. Now, I was concerned within the report because the report said that it was about 26% of income, 30% of income that was being spent, while at the same time telling me that the median income in the area per household was 17,464 per year. Well, I've got the average rent in the house in the area is £12,300, and I took Birmingham as the top of it. Although I know from my own dealings within my own ward that actually that higher average rent Birmingham seems to be the norm for my area of Sandwell. I'd have to check the rest before I could make comment on that. But that's a lot more than that smaller fraction. In fact, it's nearly half. Adding up the minimum wage, Chair, which, as we know, we've got a skills problem and we've got a hell of a lot of people that are on minimum wage in our combined areas. That's about £24,000 a year, and I'm being generous there and allowing for a couple of hours of overtime on a normal full-time contract, which would mean that more than half of the wages were being spent on rent. So for me, I'd like, if we could, Chair, get a little bit more in depth on what are our actual figures, not a guess, but what are our figures of people that are economically active? What is our actual earning power for those that are active? Where are those sort of figures coming in? Where have they come from? Because 26% of income going on rent compared to the figures we've then been given just don't quite match up for me. Thanks, Chair.
See, could you add a table in that actually splits this, I think, by authority at least, to show the median income by authority and the rate, private sector rents, I think is the one that I think we need, because we all know that social housing rents meet the criteria of not being particularly high in relation to income. But I think if we have some information on private sector rents and affordable housing rents, I don't know whether we can get into that level of detail, but would be really helpful by constituent authority. Would that work for you, Alan?
It would, Chair. It would be better than what we've got, Chair. But I think my point stands is that medium doesn't necessarily always take into account the most vulnerable. And particularly when we're dealing with affordable and social housing, we're targeting that at one. I suppose affordable housing, when you want people to buy, is not necessarily the most vulnerable. But indeed, rented accommodation, it is there for the most vulnerable that can't really get on the housing ladder themselves, particularly that affordable rented. So for me, Chair, I think it's more about those, and as Councillor previously, I'm sorry, I forgot who made the comment, but they pointed out how many economically inactive people we've got. Well, economically inactive people are picking up less than the minimum wage at the moment, unless they're going for extras within their local authorities. And we've all got problems in topping up housing benefit and topping up council tax benefit. Does that make sense, Chair?
It does. I'm just trying to think how. See, could we do it on 25th percentile of income? What data is there available on incomes that we could measure against rents? What do we have?
So in addition to the median and mean income, you should be able to get every percentile as well. That will be the annual survey of housing and earnings data that's published by the Office of National Statistics. We can certainly put it into the report, but other thing is that, Chair, if it'd be useful, we can always workshop it as well and speak to yourselves as a committee and work through that together. That'd be helpful.
That seems like an idea. I'm happy to put more time into this because I think it is important to try and define what it is we want, because there's no point you going away doing more work and then people saying, well, hang on, what about? Are people willing to put in a session? I guess we do that on Teams, will be? People willing to put in a team so we get the information we want rather than the information that Steve thinks we want, which might not be the same thing.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll organise that. Does that work for you, Ellen?
Yep, happy to participate, Chair.
Right, so we ought to be able to drill down further. I mean, if we got this by 10th percentile, 20th percentile, I mean, it sounds like there's quite a lot of data. We just need to work out what it is we want. And that's household income data, is it, you've got?
So it will be the earnings data that will be available in each percentile. Household income is not available in that level, but I think it will allow us to understand actually if you are a employee working full time on the 10th percentile, it certainly wouldn't be like 26% of your household income figure.
Okay, that's great. I think that would help move it forward. Ellen, have you got other points?
I had two more points, but I'm going to pull my last point forward because I think it's relevant to this, Chair. I think the other thing that we need to do is sort of have a look, and it's not addressed in this report really, but have a look at who's economically inactive and the reasons why. We've got more women living in the West Midlands than we have men at the moment. And historically, and even now, I know we look back and go, oh, well, historically, women fulfilled the unpaid roles they don't now. Well, they do. They still fulfill those unpaid roles. They're still the main caregiver to children. They're still the main caregiver to elderly relatives. They disproportionately have bad health outcomes. And so I think it'd be worth looking at who's actually unemployed. Economically inactive is the term, because they're not actually unemployed if you're raising a child. You've got a job. You're not unemployed if you're looking after Nana. You've got a job. So I'd like to have a look, if we could, Chair, at who's economically inactive, and if there's anything that we could do to ease their burden so that they could gain their independence back.
Yes, we'll add that to the comments of Councillor Kettle, who was also interested in this issue, because I think what we're doing is fleshing out that issue. But I think we're probably going to need to do a proper piece of work on this by the looks of it. And Ellen, your final point?
And my last point, Chair, is on the health and wellbeing. Obviously, we've got I don't know what the birth rate is. I think the birth rate would be interesting to sort of add in to the health and wellbeing as well. How many babies are we having? What's the infant mortality rate at the lower end of the scale? But also, what the health and well-being and the lack of it that we seem to be having in comparison to other areas, what are the driving factors behind that? We know that we're doing quite well on air quality. We know we're doing quite well on a number of other things. I'm not going to list them all because I think we might be here a while, but what is it? And also, Chair, I'd be interested to know the trusts that sit within the combined authority. What are their waiting lists looking like? What are their, yeah, how is there anything that could be done to improve that health and well-being that are sort of low-hanging fruits? We know we've had a lot of new doctors' appointments put in place. Is there any other resources that could be put in place to improve those outcomes? On a personal note, Chair, I've now been waiting for surgery for 18 months, and it looks like I've got another 18 months to wait. Granted, I'm not economically inactive, but I'm one of the lucky ones, aren't I? Because I can have a bad day and ask you for a link to join the meeting and still do my job. Not everybody's that fortunate. And then they go on to sick pay and things. So I'd be interested to sort of look at that health and well-being from that point of view and maybe work with some of the trusts to gather some of that data. Is that something that's possible, Chair?
Lee?
Thank you very much. Winding slightly back on the economic inactivity point, that's something that we're finding really interesting at the moment as well. So if we look at the WMCA area, our economic participation rate is the lowest amongst all combined authority areas of our current combined authorities. But then the difference is exactly as Councillor Fenton pointed out, it's very much gendered. So if we look at the economic participation of men in the West Midlands combined authority area compared to others, it's not that unusual what we're facing in WMCA, but it's noticeable in terms of women participating in the economic. In terms of economic activity, it's the lowest of all combined authority area. It's partly explained by long-term sickness, but again, and the NHS waiting list data could be quite interesting to see what that looks like. But then that only partly explains it. That's our hypothesis at the moment, really, because we are only average in that regard. The thing that is quite unusual in the WMCA area appears to be numbers who are economically inactive because they are looking after family and home. So again, it's exactly the point that Councillor Ben's making about the gender dimension of how caring responsibilities tend to fall on women more so than men, and there may also be some cultural factors that we might want to explore on this one that will explain some differences in the participation rates, but the data available to us doesn't show anything like that at this stage. But clearly, there are huge implications for growing our regional economy, which we need to get right and provide the right support for people to be in the labour market and participate in order to grow our economy. So that's something that we are very keen to explore, really.
I think that can be added to that work session we're going to do with you to actually just flesh it out a bit more. Councillor Fenton, have you concluded?
Yes, thank you so much, Chair.
No trouble. Right. I've now got Councillor Waters followed by Councillor Bateman.
Thank you, Chair. Mine's along 2.5 as well. The apprenticeships, I've actually seen that they are actually happening. Now, are these apprenticeships taken into consideration those who cannot sit, they cannot sit in the classroom and do essays and things like that to actually learn? The ones who actually, if you give them a job to do, they will get on and do that job. Whereas if you're going to expect them to pass this level and that level, they're not going to be able to do it. Because same as Councillor Kettle said, Warsaw has got one of the highest unemployment rates, and that can be due to the fact of low skills in learning, and that you give them something to do that's manual, they're absolutely fine. But you stick them in front of into a piece of paper and they're like, So that is something we need to consider. Not everyone is able to sit in the classroom and do all that. Have we got any, and also have we got any stats on how many people have actually gone into apprenticeships? Thank you.
Thank you very much. With the data that I have would show the apprenticeship staff for advanced and intermediate apprenticeships, which had effectively fallen. But at the moment, I do not have the stats on actually what the different type of apprenticeships are. So what I can do is go back and see that information available, and if so, make that available in the report so that we can see what that looks like, but different types of different sectors and looking at that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Bateman.
Yeah, it's a couple of comments. Really, I found the report fascinating as we've gone through. Kind of tickles an interest and then kind of just slightly dissipates. I'm really interested in 3.3, the inclusive economy, and where it sets out a real interesting set of figures about the makeup of the local authorities. And I know we're a complex and occasionally difficult location, but I mean it's set out in this way just begs a lot more questions, and I suppose part of those leading questions is how do we make it more equal in relation to the 7 Mets that we've got here, and what's the underlying weakness, and why are some doing better than others? Bearing in mind, if you're a Martian and you landed somewhere in the Black Country, you wouldn't know the difference really from the road you were standing in, whether you was in Wolverhampton, Walsall, West Brom or Dudley in some respects, except in Dudley you'd be out of breath because of the hills. But you know what I mean. We're almost slight difference, quirky difference in dialect, but much the same. But according to this, we aren't quite the same in relation to the economy. So I wonder, I'm looking for some words in relation to that. And then if I could just say on 3.4, the power and participation, whoa, put your head in your hands in relation to that one. Because that's nothing to skip over for us. I know it's maybe treading on the politics of it. It ain't good for the region for us to be so low in terms of the abilities for people to have a set or feel that they have they could make an impact on local decision making. Whoa, I know everybody in the world would be looking to try to improve on this one, but how do we? How do we in a non-political way? How do we improve the opportunity? For me, it's about education at so many different levels and at so many different things. But I think it's a really good report because there's other stuff in here that I know very little about, but just sets your mind thirsting for it, and I think that's a really good paper for you. I really do, and I think it's a good paper for us, and we ought to do more around it individually when we go back to our own authorities.
Thank you. Councillor Tennant.
Yeah, rather than picking up any individual thing, I was going to kind of pick the value of the report as a whole. So one thing I've been worried about, I've been raised particularly on this committee and as I do in my home council, is around starlight working. So one media organisation is doing something, basically replicating or undermining another media organisation. Reports like this can probably address those issues. So I kind of wanted to know, how wide is this report circulated amongst the organisation? Are there more detailed versions of it? Just as with that effort, because another combined party does it, that effort to reduce kind of duplication and unnecessary bits of working, we're actually coming together, we could achieve more for better value for money. Thank you.
Did you want to comment, Steve?
Thank you. So at the moment with the draft report, we're not going on just yet, but after it's gone to the West Midlands Combined Authority Board, we certainly want to run a number of webinars for internal WMC colleagues to begin with, so that we can really circulate some of these findings in a lot more detail and share with constituent local authorities as well, to make sure that there's that sight of some of these findings and encourage people to work across all aids of inclusive growth and fundamentals, so that it's not siloed in different departments or areas of work. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I must admit, a report this length with this amount of detail in it is just right for me, because I actually read it more than once. I don't know whether other people did, because you got to the end and you thought, hang on, there was something at the big. It's a really good, simple report, and in terms of, will my council leader read this? There is a reasonable chance he will do, because it is dense but short. There's a lot in it, but it's short, so it is a good report. The thing that came out of this from Councillor Fenton, did you want to come back again?
Apologies, yes, Chair. I was rereading the report while we were in the meeting, actually, and I was hoping someone else would bring it up. But I don't think I can let it go without commenting on the power and participation. I'm wondering if there's anything the Combined Authority could do for the other 75% of people who don't feel that their voice is heard. Because I think it's a shocking statistic that only 25% of people within the Combined Authority space, that's a big area, don't feel like their voice can be heard. And I'm not sure what the Combined Authority could do about this. But we all know that believing that your voice makes a difference and believing that you are a stakeholder in your community leads to more positive outcomes. Is there anything that can be done within the Combined Authority to sort of look at this, tackle this, and give people their power back?
I think you might be asking the analyst for the solution that he's looking to us for.
Chair, I think it's more of a, is it something that's worth looking more into? Is there any power within the Combined Authority to do that? If there isn't, I'm sure it's an interesting statistic we can all take back to our own authorities and start working on from there on how we're empowering our communities. But I just thought I'd ask the question, Chair, to see if it is worth it at this level.
I think this was the point that Councillor Bateman was trying to get at as well. So there's clearly a bit of an interest here. So maybe I'll put it down on my list as maybe some future work, but I think you had a comment.
Thank you. Jonathan Gibson, Head of Policy Integration. You're right to highlight it. There are two things that as a Combined Authority we have done in support of the objective of involving more residents in discussions about decisions. One is with respect to the environment. We over the last 2 years have set up a citizens panel to involve some of the residents in the discussions about the future shape of the climate policy, which was a much more deliberative way of having conversations with residents about policy making beyond what we do quite a lot of, which is consultations and green papers. So we do a lot of, here are some policy statements. There is a big consultation underway at the minute around the future of bus reform. So there are ways in which we have started that in some specific areas, and then there are some more intensive ways throughout through the form of citizens panel, but they are quite limited. They're very resource intensive. We aren't resourced to be able to do that across the board, but we have seen a number of other policy issues use that technique to have really meaningful conversations about policy, not least, the future of abortion reform in Ireland, for example, but we just aren't resourced to do it across the board. There are a range of specific groups and forums for involvement, whether it's the Race Equalities Task Force, for example, that brings together a number of different parties with an interest in that same theme, but from an element of racialised inequalities, which meet quite regularly. So, are we doing some things? Yes. Could we be doing more with resources? We possibly could, but to do those things well and properly do mean having the kind of proper strategy to do them. So I hope that is two initial examples, but it's a very good question, and thank you both for raising it.
Thank you, Chair. Under equality, 3.9, there's it states that ethnic communities in social housing are spending 40% of their income on rent compared to 34% of white households. I'd just like some information, more information on that could tease out why this is.
The answer in short is we don't know the reasons why. There was a study, a national study done recently looking at like family size, household size and things like that. But in answer, we don't know. We don't have the data that breaks things down by ethnic minority as well. We know that there'll be big differences in this. We know that like Bangladeshi and Pakistani communities are more likely to be spending more and living in overcrowded housing, but we don't have the data to back that up. And we don't understand the reasons as to why they're spending more. We can't conclusively say it's because their incomes are lower. Unfortunately, the data just isn't there for that.
Does the data show the local authorities?
So we have there's a breakdown in part of the report. So there's the spending, and then there's yes, we have income spent on new social homes and the proportion spending on that by ethnic minority, and that breaks it down further. But we don't have spending in terms of other forms of social housing, forms of housing. Yeah, not the local authority level.
Would you be able to forward me some information on that? I'll do some of my own research into that. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
I've now got Councillor Walters, followed by Councillor Cathal.
Thank you, Chair. Along the lines of what, I don't know what his name is, hasn't got his badge in front of him. Thank you, Jonathan. What Jonathan actually said regarding the customer panels. Now, I've actually had a quick conversation with Pete Bond when I came in regarding the bus franchise survey. And I actually pointed out that I went onto the public one to have a look at, and some of it is a little bit less understandable, those who've got a low education level. And I actually pointed out that when you're doing a survey, it just needs to be simplified, because not everybody's going to want to go the way we would. Not everyone is going to want to go through that and actually answer all these questions. But he actually said with that, it's actually something the government have asked for, the scrutiny on it. But I said one suggestion I actually gave was, in the bus stations, there's actually these screens and things can actually be bullet pointed of what this is and what that is. And that can go along with other things the combined authorities doing. That's your screen to the people. If you want to get some message out there, simplify, basic, bullet points so as people can understand, because they're standing there and they'll be reading it. Because say not everybody is gonna they want to have their say, they want to know what's going on, but they do not want to go through a long-winded survey or long-winded information like we do. It's actually simplifying for the people. Thank you.
After Councillor Kettle, I'm going to draw this to a close because we are now almost 11:45 and we're one item through the agenda. So if that's all right.
I would have thought of Mr. Chairman. Yes. I think one aspect we should look at the overall, the overall view of accommodation, and that is that 2/3 of properties are owned outright. Most people think that mortgages are a massive influence on our society. In actual fact, 2/3 of our properties are owned outright. Obviously, newcomers that come into our environment, let's call it our economic environment, because this is what an aspect of what we're talking about. They have less chance of building up inherited wealth. They have less chance of building up assets in the if you would say the 20 formative years when they come into our economic environment. Obviously, they do not build up assets and properties that they can pass on to their children in the first 20 years. And this also is going to skew the figures on percentage of accommodation paid in rent. If you look at it like that, you know, it's understandable that the overall picture is a distortion, certainly, but newcomers into our society haven't had the chance to build up assets, haven't had the chance to create inherited wealth, and it does distort the figures. There's no doubt about it. So that is my insight into the overview of why there is so much distortion in the amount of the percentage of income paid towards accommodation. And that explains it, I think, quite precisely, if you look at it like that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor. Now, what I've written down, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is the areas that we might want to look more deeply as a group in the future: air pollution and air quality, particularly on the roads. So this is not CO2. This is about all those other things that cause bad health. Hopefully, I've got that right. Progress on the reduction of inequalities. On NEETs, who is actually economically inactive? Some potential work on health and wellbeing around NHS waiting list data and the barriers that health are to moving into economic activity. Voter participation and the impact of education, which I think I got down as we want to know more about what we're doing and the success for manual worker training, as well as the level 3 and above training. How effective has the combined authority been at spend a lot of money? Can we actually prove that any of it actually had any positive impact? And if so, should we be doing more of it? And if so, where? That and within that is apprenticeships as well.
Yeah.
Was there anything I missed off that list, or is that basically it?
If I may, Mr. Chairman, may I suggest that when we look at youth unemployment, we also look at youth and unemployment law, because it is so restrictive for employers to employ young people and apprentices. A one-to-one situation where if you have an apprentice, they need a full-time overseer is very restrictive. Mm-hmm. And having been through an apprenticeship, a 5-year apprenticeship early on in my life, I couldn't see that working in thousands and thousands of companies, and people are very reluctant to employ young people because of the restrictions in law. Could we have this looked into, please?
Well, we can certainly look at whether that is a restraint on training for sure. If that's it, I'll move on. See, thank you very much. You've clearly caused a lot of debate. And no, that was the purpose of the work and the presentation. That's been very helpful. Thank you very much. Jonathan, you're on.
Thank you very much, Chair. The item I'm going to talk to you today is the second on the agenda on the integrated settlement. And if you are looking at that and thinking you have deja vu, that is not the case. We did come and talk this item through on the 20th of January at the previous overview and scrutiny committee, and explained where the combined authority and local authorities were up to in the process of implementing the integrated settlement. And at that meeting, we said we would do a couple of things. One, we would come back to you and go through each of the 5 functional strategies which you've got in your agenda packs. We also said we would publish a web page that explains what the integrated settlement is for members of the public, which we have done and which is now online. We came back with a few more bits of information on heat pumps, I think, as requested last time, which we've got the team who did that here as well. And also we amended the report on education to explain that the resources available can also support vocational as well as academic provision. So what we are coming back to you with today that is different to that is to explain to you what the functional strategies are that will effectively set out how the combined authority and with local authorities and others are going to invest the first integrated settlement. So we talked a lot last time about the numbers and the overall funding envelope, but the strategies you've got in your agenda packs give a deeper explanation of how that funding is going to be prioritised and used. So in your agenda packs, and I won't go through all 5 of them, but you do have 5 distinctive functional strategies. One is for adult skills and employment. Another is for housing and regeneration. Another further still for local transport, building retrofit, and for local growth and place. So they reflect the 5 main funding streams that are available through the integrated settlement. And the strategies give the explanation of the overall approach to investing each of those strands. They don't represent the overall amount of funding and resource available to the combined authority. Integrated settlement is £389 million this year, will be at least 600 million next year, we think. But the combined authority budget is more significant than, and includes, for example, the levy paid by local authorities and other forms of income, such as business rates, for example. But what these strategies do is give the explanation of that particular part of our investment, which is the majority of the grant funding we receive from central government. Underpinning each of the functional strategies, to explain the how, will be a series of business cases that explain the what. So the business cases will say, here's what we are going to invest in next year. There will be 3 business cases to go to WMCA board on the 14th of March. You'll hear about one of them with respect to buildings retrofits shortly, and the others will be about bus reform, the bus network, and another will be about the UK Shared Prosperity Fund that we've been delivering both for a long time, but this gives an update and accounts for the funding available to the region. Once we've agreed the business cases, that will then the funding will then enter the world through a number of different ways, including allocations to local authorities, direct commissioning to external bodies, whether it's colleges or in some cases bus operators, but they are all to be decided and shaped by the strategies that we have set out here. So the main thing we wanted to kind of provide you with an opportunity for is to ask any questions about each of the 5. If it would be helpful, we can say a little bit more about what is in each, but I'm mindful of your time, so happy to open it up to there and take any questions or go into any layer of detail that would be helpful for me to go into. So I will leave it there, Chair, and very happy to take questions and feedback.
Thank you. I guess I need to remind people transport is not ours. I know everybody wants to dive into buses and trains, but it is not ours.
I would have done my bit on that.
In terms of questions, could you explain how the 5 pillars link together? I think that's probably going to be worthwhile you just explaining what your thought process is on how these things actually mutually support each other, obviously including transport, because transport is an enabler to the others. So I think that rather than get into the detail, if you just give an overview on that, I think that might be helpful.
That's a very good question, Chair. So there are at least 3 ways in which we have tried to break down the silos between what are 5 very related areas of investment, because ultimately they are all the ingredients that places need to thrive. You don't just do one and everything's better. You need to do all 5 of them at the same time, aligned to what the conditions are in the region. So one of the main areas and tactics we employed to do that is to develop place-based strategies that we introduced last time. But what the place-based strategies have helped us to do is to, working with local authorities, understand how each of the pillars of the integrated settlement can respond to the challenges and opportunities in places. So they are in some ways a very helpful framework for knowing this is the particular type of housing infrastructure and the transport infrastructure and the labour market needs these skills. They're a framework to bring together and organise some of the investments we can make. So being able to use place and the needs of places is one of the ways in which we can start to join together some of the funding streams. That said, there are some principles as a combined authority that shape how we use funding, for example, inclusive growth. So that is a framework that shapes how we use the majority of our funding. That's less about place, but what are the principles that we try and factor into how we then use the resources available to us. And then beyond that, there are some very particular areas where across the 5 we share, and we will try to share a number of the same principles. For example, what are the priority sectors of the economy that we are all trying to grow? That is partly shaping the skills funding that we've got, because you need to align the skills provision to those sectors, and it is also aligned to the local growth and place pillar and the plan for growth that we have. Another example would be, what is the trajectory for decarbonisation that we're on? So we've set out a West Midlands 2041 strategy that is partly shaping the transport project, but is also obviously shaping our decarbonisation strategy as well for buildings retrofit. So there are 3 ways in terms of how we are starting to look beyond the functional silos, and having worked in central government, combined authorities are much better able to do that than central government, because everything is under one political roof. It's not under 22, as is in the case of central government. But they are the 3 ways. But for this year, we are starting to do it. Have we got it absolutely right? And is everything completely aligned? No, but there is a kind of, they are the basis for next year. But it's something we need to keep challenging ourselves, because it's a really questions coming from the right place.
Thank you. I have got Councillor McKee, followed by Councillor Fenton, followed by Councillor Baton, followed by Councillor Tennant.
Thanks very much. I'm glad that bit you said about the politics, because it is like we're all here regional first, and then we slice that up into politics within the region, if you know what I mean. The most important thing is we get the best deal for the West Midlands from whoever the government is. There's a couple of points, but the first one was a bit of a showstopper when I read 2.4, because it says, obviously talks about there's no detriment and we're not financially worse off, and then goes on to say that we'll have received 30 million less than we did last time, which I think it's fair enough to say that that you got the best deal you could get. I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that, but I think sometimes you do have to come out and say, we're slightly disappointed that we're 30 million less than we got last time, because I think, it's, as we've heard on the other items, there's an awful lot of deprivation against the West Midlands, and being able to throw an extra 30 million pounds at that would certainly, would certainly sound would certainly go some way to improving people's lives. And just for someone who's, because obviously we all have jobs and we do commercial things outside of here, and I have to do a reasonable amount of negotiation, that if I said to someone, okay, you're going to get 30 million next this year. And we went, okay, that's fine. There's no detriment. We're not any financially worse off. Next year, I'll be going, right, okay, I'm knocking another 30 million off that, or percentage wise, because I tell you what, we're giving them too much money because they're not bothered. And I'm not saying you're not bothered, by the way. I should imagine you probably were negotiating really hard to get the best deal you were going to get. But it doesn't say it in the report here. Our residents will sit here, read these papers and say it's no detriment. They're not financially worse off. And yet they've got 30 million less than they might. You know what I mean? Because they'll be disappointed, because we're going to have to turn around to say to residents that, we were hoping to do all this, but we can't, but we'll do our best. But we got the best deal. So I think there's just a bit of the mood music coming off there. I mean, as politicians, we can all then scrap about how we want to spend it. But the thing is, we're all united getting the best deal as we can for the region. The other one, 2.7, just a bit of internal navel gazing, I should say. There, obviously, it's talking about Druids Heath, Ladywood, and Langley. Just to let you know that they're incredibly controversial developments that, again, all being done for the best of reasons. And at the end of it, people will, would look at that and say, wow, look at the improvements that have been done here. But the residents who live there are livid. They've been protesting outside Council House. They've come in, they've been asking questions. And they're absolutely furious because they feel that things are being done to them, not for them. And so I just think that's something we need to be mindful of when we do these scenarios, because they're all communities in themselves, and they feel that their communities have been broken up and destroyed. Now, that's not being done by here, but obviously we're supplying money to that. And so I think something just to be mindful of, and obviously because some of those residents may decide to bring their concerns to us as we're supplying money to it. I'm not saying it will, but just for whoever. That's me anyway. Thanks very much, Chair.
Your first point was about it might be worth inserting into this paper before it goes to the board where that £30 million has been lost. And I think, Kate, you are able to explain that, because I think you informally chatted, but to help the board understand where that money isn't anymore and why it's not.
I mean, the reality is it is across many, many different streams. It's not it's just come out of one particular pot. It is, that 30 million. And I think we have to be careful not to get hung up on the 30 million, because the reality is that 30 million doesn't exist in terms of government spending has decreased, and therefore our share of that pie that we can have has decreased ultimately, funding that is available. So there is a schedule which is in the board report, which I think is the schedule that has already been sent to you as members. You had a copy of it as part of supplementary information for the budget, and I think we have sent out a updated schedule that shows ultimately what we had in 24-25, of which I will just caution some of those were year 3 or 3-year allocations, and the funding was backloaded. We chose a profile that backloaded that funding in, so it is a higher number that we are looking at in there, and gives that detail about the no detriment. But I think I understand your point around actually being a little bit stronger, I think perhaps with the wording of it, but I think we have to just be careful about not getting hung up on a 30 million that isn't something that we have lost, I guess, as a negotiation team, so to speak.
Can I come back on that? Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but I mean, if we put it in a different context, Birmingham City Council tomorrow, we've got our budget meeting, and obviously you can understand Birmingham's had its financial challenges, I think is the best way to put it, to Section 114s and Section 5, and part of the argument that we put forward by the colleagues across the chamber for me will be that they did not get the funding from government that they wanted. And if I was to stand up there and say, but don't worry about it, let's not get hung up on however many hundreds of millions of pounds, because do you know what? It never existed in the first place. Right? I'd probably need security to escort me from the building, and I think that, we're in a different atmosphere here, and it's meant to be one that is, critical friend and all that. But that's all I'm just trying to say is that it has massive implications for people outside of this room.
Mm.
And I'm not trying not to be critical of views, because I'm pretty sure you did the absolute level best to get the best deal that you could get for the area. But I just feel that sometimes, you know, that needs firming up that paragraph. I think it really does.
Mm.
Thanks so much.
Okay, my understanding of this is there was a general reduction in support for combined authorities across the country, of which we took our share.
Yeah.
That's one thing. And there were one or two specific programs that the government have said these do not appear to be effective, therefore we're reducing the funding on. And the one that springs to mind is boot camps.
Skills boot camps is the big. So there are two probably big draws in there, and actually we have done better in some areas, and there's ups and downs in there. So skills boot camp is a particular one, and obviously UK SPF, where the national fund was reduced by 40%, but actually our contribution was not 40%; it was around.
I think you need to put some detail, that level of detail in here, in 3 or 4 bullet points underneath that, to just make it to cover Councillor McKee's point, which I think is we have not done badly compared to the rest of the regions.
No,
One might argue that everybody has done badly, but it needs to demonstrate that, to a certain extent, that you guys have done a good job.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got the point right. Yes.
Chair, I'd perhaps take a contrary view to this, because 2.4 is abundantly clear that the 30 million less is actually about the non-detrimental size, which is what the report is on about, is about what funding they got was around, and it wasn't detrimental. The fact that it reduced by 30 million was because of everybody else's being reduced. So I don't think we should get hung up on, and this report, which isn't about the fact that there's been a reduction. So I don't actually share that needs firming up, to be perfectly honest.
I just say the report says the line below that we are not financially worse off, before then goes on to say that we've got 30 million less. I think that there needs to be some clarification about that. Otherwise, anyone else reading that report would think we're clinically insane, actually.
I think the nuance is we are not financially worse off from being within integrated settlement than we would be from without integrated. And that's where new detriment, no detriment, you're right, comes into it. Is about, would you be worse off being in or outside the integrated settlement?
I think all these things are true.
Yeah, they just need putting in a report, don't it?
Yeah.
That would be my suggestion, because I suspect otherwise people will ask exactly the same question as Councillor McKee has done. And it literally is 2 bullet points by the looks of it. These specific programmes have been reduced, and I only know of one, which is the boot camps, but there might be another one. But in general terms, the overall pot has come down. But you also made another point, which was there was one thing, whatever this big alphabet soup thing is, our share of that hasn't gone down as much as other people's. And I think 3 bullet points, I think, is just going to help. Because you are right, people reading this report will get the wrong end of the stick.
Mr. Chairman, has there been a deliberate attempt here to mislead us?
No, I don't think so. No, because it's all in the detail in appendix, whatever it is. But it just needs pulling out the appendix and putting it in, so it's clear. Because this is a summary. But what people don't read it all. They won't get past it.
No.
How can you be 30 million worse off and not be having detriment? There's no detrimental effect. You've got to be affected by it. That's misleading, totally misleading.
There's no detriment versus had we not been in the integrated settlement. That's what this means. But it can be interpreted the way that you have just interpreted it. Therefore, the wording is not.
Yeah.
Needs a little bit of working on. If it can be misinterpreted, some people will misinterpret it.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
10%.
So if you could just tweak it, that would be helpful. John.
I was just going to come back on your second point about teeth and developments. So They reflect the emerging themes within the Birmingham place-based strategy. So for the last year or so, colleagues in Birmingham have been working on, if you were to use the kind of flexibilities we have to target investments to achieve the types of change that need you to do lots of things at the same time, that is one of the types of themes in their place-based strategy. So it's a work in progress. The Birmingham place-based strategy hasn't been through Birmingham Council yet. There will be time to do that over this year, but we have given some indicative, here's the direction of travel for where it's going yet. So the most important thing to say as well as that is that they aren't the only places that are ever going to be eligible to receive support throughout housing funds. They are just the places where colleagues in Birmingham have said, here's where we need to do something a bit different to just, here's a housing scheme, where does it sit on a pipeline, and how ready is it for investment. So I hope that provides reassurance, but there will be more time, hopefully within Birmingham, to have that conversation about what is the place-based strategy and what it says. But I hope that's helpful. There's not much to add on the first point, but can take that feedback on.
Thank you. If we can move on to Councillor Fenton, please.
Thank you, Chair. I don't really have questions to pull out of the report per se, because it seems to me that the strategies are very near to completion now, and I have nothing to sort of add to them. But my question is on the outcomes, and how are the outcomes going to be monitored? What role as scrutineers are we going to be expected to take in that, or is it for us to be able to set our own direction through the chair as to how we want to monitor this? Because now it's nearly complete, it all has to be on that. Is this going to improve people's lives? Is this going to improve our local economy? And is this going to have positive outcomes? So, Chair, I'm much more interested in how we monitor this and how this goes forward to ensure that it's got good outcomes than I am in sort of the strategy that seems to me to be quite solid, based on good evidence and pretty much complete.
For me, that is a very good question, which is why I wanted the work programme discussed by us as a group, because it is for us to decide how we want to do the monitoring. The officers will, of course, be monitoring, and we will review their monitoring reports, but we might want something more, or we might want it in a different order, or whatever. That would be how I see it. I don't know if anybody else sees it differently.
I seem to remember about a year ago that this was actually a subject that was going to be specifically taken up as to what this committee would have regarding the integration. And here we are a year later, and we're just discussing it, but we've had no guidance as to how we as a committee would integrate with the overview and scrutiny of it.
So, it's a really good question. In some ways, we will be led by you on what level of involvement you want. We are really open and receptive to that completely. So, how it will work is that the outcomes that we will have to deliver against, and that we will ultimately report into government, there will be potentially 6 monthly points in the middle of the year when we will collect data and evidence and then they will be reported into a programme board, which is where West Midlands Combined Authority, Greater Manchester Combined Authority, and all of the departments that have, all 7 of the departments that have funds, come together and look at what is the progress that is being made to deliver the outcomes, and importantly the targets that are attached to them. So there are a number of different ways in which you as a committee could be involved in as part of that process. That could be after the 6 monthly reporting period, where you are looking at what we've collected at that point. It could be just before we report into government. It could be on an annual basis, before or after. The information will be there. We're doing a lot of work as a combined authority to make sure we've got the structures in place to be able to manage the flow of information into a central point, so we can have overall oversight. So, Councillor Fenton, yes, we will have that. And Chair, if you wanted to think about what your preferences are, depending on whether you want more or less involvement, we would be very happy to facilitate that.
to me, this is one of those issues where we need to discuss the principles. We can go and say, we're spending 100 million there. We want to understand what we're getting for it. Or we can try and do all 500 million or whatever it is and try and have a look. Do we go for the detail or do we go for the overall or do we do some mixture of both? And that's the conversation we need to have. In my own mind, I have a view, but my view is not our view. And we need to discuss that amongst ourselves on exactly how we want to do this. Because it was interesting, the list that we got from C's presentation. To me, those are deep dive issues. But looking for value for money, I think is something historically we've not necessarily done. Well, certainly not in the last period of time I've been on here. We've kind of thought that's kind of an audit issue and we've left it to audits. But I think, are we actually getting value for all this money that we're spending and can we prove it? Because if programs aren't working, we ought to discontinue them and try something else. So that's kind of, but we need to have that discussion amongst ourselves, will be my view. Kate.
It might be, we're at the beginning of this kind of journey, I guess. So we're moving towards this. So it might be something as a committee that you want an in-depth session, perhaps understanding what the outcomes are, the data. So that might give you a bit of a guide of actually how you want to then kind of work going forward. I suppose my other just of integrated that part of our funding as part of that. While you're not transport, we have a transport level, we have some funding sitting outside as well of that. So the Youth Trailblazer pilot, for example, in there, those are all kind of coming together to supercharge that kind of economic growth and support those. So actually it's about monitoring all of the activity of the combined authority rather than, I say just, but just the 389 million that sits in part of the budget.
Ellen, are you happy that we take this as a discussion amongst ourselves as part of our work programme, and maybe on part of our work programme might be to get into more detail on how we would do this? So have discussions about discussions. Does that work for you?
Yeah, I know that sounds a bit terrible, doesn't it? Chair, discussions about discussions, but I absolutely think they're necessary. I mean, we know that part of the settlement agreement is to improve scrutiny. And possibly at that meeting, we could have a larger talk about how as scrutineers we're going to take a more active role and how we're going to look at things, budget included. Is that something you're open to, Chair?
Absolutely.
That would be my recommendation then, Chair.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Baton.
Chair, and I suppose it picks up a little bit on the last discussion. But also on C's presentation. So we saw from C's presentation all of the areas where we are struggling in the West Midlands and falling behind. Are we assured from the strategy that you presented that actually this strategy addresses all of those issues? And I guess it's that, you know, then we look at the detail going forward to ensure that we have the, you know, going forward we have the assurance that it does. But in terms of the strategy that's being presented today, are you assured as that yes, it will start to address all of those deficits that we've got within the West Midlands region?
Give you a very simple answer, which is no. For example, the combined authority only has control over 10% of skills and training funding that flows to the region. Outside of the integrated settlement and beyond the combined authority, there are other forms of investment in housing and regeneration. Follow home programme, for example. The government is still running a whole range of government-led programmes for innovation, business support, and so on and so forth. So we as a combined authority and region are, you know, ahead of others when it comes to devolution, but do we have all of the levers under the control of local democratic leadership here? No, we don't, and the strategies reflect that. So we have the most control over funds that are devolved, and because of that, we can use that to then leverage other forms of investment that are outside of our control, but we haven't completed devolution yet, and as a result, a lot of the issues in the report that require a much more regionally integrated response from all of the different, you know, health energy, utility, infrastructure providers to really make the type of difference that CE's evidence has highlighted. Part of our role is not just about controlling and shaping the funding, but how do we bring those different agencies together as part of a regional conversation or regional strategy to be able to address them. So in short, I don't want to downplay the significance of the integrated settlement, but it is 400 next year, be about £600 million of investment across a huge amount of money that is flowing through the region. That our other role as a strategic body is to convene and to ensure there is a shared plan around. So and please don't take that as a kind of lack of ambition from the politicians here or anywhere, but it's a statement of fact that we aren't at the end of our devolution journey to be able to say this is a strategy for all the resources that need to be marshalled for in addressing the challenges he highlighted.
So I think then as a committee, that context is really important when we monitor and look and how we are going to oversee the outcomes and outputs, because it's about being really big, isn't it? And I think we have to ensure that we have a thorough understanding of that over the next 12 months. And obviously it will change, won't it, as we move through and, more money's devolved and powers are devolved. So it will change over the next few years. But where we are now, I think we have to be really clear on realistic expectations, because otherwise this committee is going to be coming back in 12 months and saying, well, actually the state of the region report hasn't improved that much. What have you been doing? When actually we will know that the levers aren't there, and those certain bits are outside of our control. So I think the context is just really, really important. Thank you.
I think that's a really key point you've raised there. At the end of the day, the integrated settlement is a box of bits. It is not integrated in except as we can make it integrated as a combined authority. It was a load of stuff that they've given us that you've attempted to fashion into a strategy that might work overall. And hopefully it will be better than the alternative. Is it going to be fully there? The answer is no, it isn't, because you haven't got all the levers, as Kathy said. It's a really good point, Kathy. So we need to be realistic. Jonathan.
I would say just a slight distinction to that. So, I mean, the outcomes that we negotiate with government and the targets for the integrated settlement, we have went into those conversations on the basis of they are things that flow from the money and the tools available. So, and we can, Chair, use the resources of the CA to say how do we make the most of them through, how do we join the local integrated through some of the things we talked about earlier. So I wouldn't say we have control and agency responsibility to do a good job at that bit, but I think the question of do we have all of the levers at our disposal to address the scale of some of the challenges that face the region in CE's report, that is where the devolved resources we have are part of the mix, but the economy of the region is £77 billion, to actually start to change that at the scale that is needed requires much more than the £600 million integrated settlement, £1.5 billion CA budget. So that is more a question about how we as a region are collectively using our combined resources together. It's not about just the CA, but it's about some of the bodies. So I think there are two things there. One is accountability for delivering outcomes for the integrated settlement, where you would have a kind of legitimate argument to say, how are you getting on there? But the other one is about how we are convening all partners to do the scale of change that's the side. So I just thought I'd add that distinction.
Councillor Kevin, do you have something that's directly relevant to what we've just been talking about?
Yes, if I may. One that was an issue of allocation. So, that figure you just mentioned about the West Midlands economy, how many billion was it?
77.
77 billion. Okay. I went earlier on about allocation, the way its funds are allocated, and I'm looking at page 28, 217.1 to 217.6, where the ideas of what we call our priorities for the 7 different areas, and yes. Communication around looking at seriously congestion is a real problem for us, but so is investment. And when I see the amount of money that's gone into Coventry and Coventry Town Centre and the ideas of the Giga Park, and I think we also overlook the fact that on 217.5 we have got the hub coming to Solihull, which is going to have a major impact on our economy in the West Midlands. When HS2 it lands in Solihull, there's no mention of it here, and there are going to be issues of integration when the hub is Solihull. It's going to be massive. It's going to be a national impact on our area, and yet it isn't even mentioned here that any form of integration is going to be necessary, and I think it will be necessary to a serious degree. So when it comes to allocation, there are distortions there. I don't deny that all necessary, but I think fundamentally at the beginning of the year, you've got to look at the way this is shared out. And yes, we'd like to see the metro finished in Dudley, and we hope to see the benefits of it very soon. But I think when I look at 217.1 to 217.6 on page 28, I look at Dudley in the middle, and we rate 2 lines, and I feel as though we're on the back foot. So when it comes to allocations, I'd like to see per capita allocations a major more influence on what we do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I mean, so there is underneath this report and underneath some of the business cases which say for different programs what are the nature of the allocations to different places. That is possible in some instances. So we devolve quite a significant share of the funds to local authorities to then onward deliver in their areas. UK Shared Prosperity Fund, some adult skills funding, the retrofit funding that we'll hear from a bit later. So some of it is allocated to places based on criteria. But I would say there are some aspects of how our regional economy works, to the point earlier, that mean in some ways, because there are, I think, around 200,000 people who live in one part of the combined authority area but work in another, the issue is less about which is the place getting the funding, but are the people across the region able to get to that place to access the jobs there, because people are moving around the region so much. I think it's about 17.5% of the region is living and working in a different place. So in some ways, as long as the investment is going into a place that is generating good jobs that people can access, the higher paid jobs, the better. But we need to kind of keep both of those. It's a very valid question. We need to keep both in mind. Yes, areas do benefit from funding directly, and people are benefiting from what's happening in other areas. So I think we'd be able to share, what could be austere on in terms of what could be shared in the public domain around allocations to specific areas. We have done that and are speaking to local authorities quite a bit. We'd be happy to share that with yourself as a committee, and that will be in each of the business cases that then go to a investment board or WMCA board for decision.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, there's a point made there. You cannot withdraw information that we ask for. At our level, we need to be anything that is available. You should allow us to have.
I think it's a question of when it would be available. So I think on the 14th of March, we will bring the 2 business cases to WMCA board that will set out allocations to places from the UK SPF and then retrofit. And then I think it may be in April when the other business cases come to WMCA board, which then set out the allocations for the 2 other programs that are onward awarded. So we wouldn't withhold information about when are we able to bring that together into an overall package that's reflective of the different ways in which funding is allocated to areas after the business case has been agreed. But yeah.
Kate.
There is a schedule that will be, it will be an appendix in the budget report that will be going out Thursday night to there that shows the integrated settlement and allocations where they have been agreed already or discussed with your officers for that's going to each area. Some of those are still TBC because there are still ongoing discussions that are happening there. So it's gone to your finance directors and chief execs to pass sight of that. So I'd be more than happy to share that with the committee kind of now. To be honest, we share that today.
Thank you. And just for reassurance, HS2 is in here, because that's in my book. And it's actually wrapped up in North Solihull and UK Central. And those two are part of a growth zone, which includes part of Birmingham. Is it your ward, or is it just close to you?
It's my old employer. Chad.
Old employer, yes. Yes. So it is there. And obviously, HS2, that's one stopping point for HS2 in the West Midlands, and the other one is at Curzon Street, which is linked, hopefully, by the metro network to lots of other areas. So it sits behind here, but it's not a West Midlands Combined Authority project, and therefore, I guess that's why it's not in here. Our projects, both boroughs and Combined Authority, would take account of that, as indeed they would any changes in Birmingham Airport and other major strategic hubs. I've got that right, have I?
But we'll come back to you with a fuller answer if that's okay, Councillor Gettle, because even if it isn't a WMCA project, I know colleagues in Solihull will be thinking about how are we using our PBS to add value to this huge investment that's coming there, and they won't have ignored it. So what we'll do is we'll come back with a short note on exactly how that project is being built on by their place-based strategy, which in the same vein as the response to Councillor Mackie earlier, a lot of this thinking is still emerging within local authorities. There will be more time for discussion. So what you see on this page is not the end of the story. That's it. There'll be more time for colleagues in Solihull to take us through. But in the meantime, we can come back with some further information. That's helpful. Okay.
Thank you. I've got now Councillor Tennant, Councillor Walters and Councillor Bateman, unless yours was specifically around this.
Mine's about protecting myself, and I just want to remind the committee that I've got a non-pecuniary interest in relation to Birmingham International Airport. And all of a sudden, we started to get awfully close, and started to make myself twitch. I'm a director on there from Wolverhampton. And while I just say that, I just make the point, you know, the HS2 is really important, but there's also growth taking place, and also developments taking place at the airport, which will have some fundamental impacts on the local authorities. The local economies of the Seven Mets.
That is why I mentioned the airport. Councillor Tennant.
Thank you. Councillor Benton actually picked up the first half of my point. I would just add, so I was going through the papers in the appendix where you've got some nice tables on outcomes against each things, which I think are good ideas, but a lot of it is TBC, including the bit that slightly worried me was all the baseline stuff is TBC, which I would hope be data we already hold. So I don't know, it's just not been populated to report yet, but I wanted to check on that. And then just kind of digging into the housing stuff in more detail. So the strategies around affordable and social housing, yeah, you just say you're bringing together resources and funding to build a joint pipeline to society. So again, I know the mayor talked about it when we had him for us, and we've got that before, but some more detail there. And again, let's go back to Councillor Mackie's points on, so we talk about state regeneration. You mentioned here Ladywood and Druids Heath. I had the joys of Ladywood in front of me in Birmingham committee last week, and I've got Druids Heath coming up again. It'd be useful to know, kind of, given those works are already quite far down the process, including particularly Druids Heath, and come out many already gone in. What does the combined authority see as its role? Is it to support either with money and capacity, Birmingham City Council, and in Ladywood's case, the private developer, or is it about building more stuff on top of that and being much more active rather than just kind of that background support? So yes, that's my questions.
Thank you, Chair. Very good question. So on the first one about baseline data, so yes, as a combined authority, we will have baseline data for each of the outcomes and how we are currently performing. What that will refer to is this is an area of the integrated settlement where we are still to fully agree with government what the outcomes, outputs and targets are. We know roughly what the outcomes and outputs are going to be. It's the target bit that we are still in very, very live negotiations with government about what that's going to be. So you'll hear about net zero soon and bus and housing. They are the areas where we've still got a bit of journey to go with government. For some of the other areas, local growth and place, adult skills, employment support, we are probably looking at the same picture as we are today. So the baseline data refers to we don't yet know exactly what government's starting point is going to be. We will ourselves have the data to collect it once we know that. I think the answer to your second and third question is similar-ish. So partly prompted by the integrated settlement, but one of the pieces of work we and local authorities with the support of Homes England have been doing is to amass the kind of total range of housing and regeneration schemes that are available across the region. So we've been doing a piece of work to work out what's our total pipeline of schemes. What that is enabling us to do is to work out which of the schemes that feel ready, which aren't quite ready yet, which are the schemes that are going to deliver the most benefits. And that is a piece of work that will enable us to prioritise of the some £63 million of housing and regen available funding for next year. How do we start to match the pipeline of schemes with the funding available? And so there are additional resources that predate the integrated settlement as well that will be used to work out how can we deliver the priorities. But in terms of the two schemes you mentioned, Druids Heath and Ladywood, I can come back with a definitive answer, but the principle is where there is additional resource needed for schemes that meet the right criteria. This isn't about kind of, doubling, this isn't about, duplication, but where can we use that resource to support schemes that are high up on the priority list to then enable us to go further, because we understand they're quite significant schemes. But as well as that, the reason why we can do something different through the work on place-based strategies is because it's not, we aren't just limited by housing and regeneration funding. That is also about what is the nature of the types of transport schemes or the nature of the skills and entry-level labour market schemes that are needed alongside housing investments. So there are probably, that is a slightly waffly answer, but there are two parts. One, where schemes are ready, we can use our devolved funds to support them when they're at the top of a prioritised list. But through PBS, place-based strategies, we can then bring in other levers, because places don't just need housing and regen, they need some of those other forms of support as well. I can come back with a specific answer on where exactly those two schemes are in the pipeline.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Right. Yes, please.
And just picking up what you were saying there about, because obviously when we give money to, let's say, Ladywood, for example, we'll have an ask that obviously we want in return for those funds, or certain criteria have got to be met. How easily is it? Because I mean, Ladywood is mostly private money that's obviously working in partnership with Birmingham City Council. So of course, the private sector will have their ask for them bringing their money in. So when we deliver our money, we have our ask. Do the musts align all that easily on?
I'll have to go in and come back with a bit more detail on the specifics, but these are the nature of negotiations with developers around, the requirements, the intervention rate, the share of affordable homes. So no is the answer. They don't always align. But in terms of the specifics of these cases, I can come back to you with a bit more information rather than give you something that's wrong.
On this particular housing issue, if I understand right, all of these schemes are driven by the 7 Mets. You come in to help the 7 Mets with money Basically, that's the model that we're operating. So this is not being imposed by the combined authority on any community. If it's being imposed by anybody, it's being imposed by the metropolitan councils. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, so every scheme from a housing and regeneration is put forward by either a developer or a local authority, and then we work through it. Yes, we are not kind of going out identifying.
And one thing that Councillor Bayton will remember, because we did 18 months ago, there was no reliable statistics on what was happening, where the money was going, how many houses were being created, how many of those were affordable, how many of those were social. We now have a very good suite of numbers, I think. One thing the committee might want to consider looking at next year is what is the success of all that money? What is it actually generating and where? That might be one of the things that we want to look at. If we could just note that on our list of things to be considered, we might end up with a list that's far too long. But I think the point of, I think a lot of councillors are very worried about housing. And it is now Councillor Waters.
Right. Thank you, Chair. Now, mine isn't a question, mine is just an overview. Myself and Councillor Burrow actually attended an online meeting with our combined authorities, and you know, you go around the room, you say, well, on Teams, and you actually say X, Y, and Z. And I have to say, my thoughts are we are doing really well with our scrutiny, because we'd say, somebody would say X, Y, and Z, and I think, well, no, we actually allowed to do that. We do this, we do that. So we are doing really well. We really are allowed, not allowed, but we actually do scrutinise really, really well. Thank you.
I concur with that. I mean, the stories that we hear
elsewhere.
I have nothing further to add apart from just one small point that's on 217.5. You have got the single most important community in the West Midlands mentioned in that, which is Balsall Common, perhaps we were. And we're getting lots of housing. Anyway, any further comments on this paper? I think to me this has been quite helpful, understanding how integrated it can be. And as we move down this line, we're going to learn, aren't we, as we go along. So we're now going to move on to one of the specifics in this, which is the devolved buildings retrofit pilots. I'm not sure whether it's the buildings that are devolved or the which I know it's not. I don't know if anybody had a chance to read this. We asked for it as a summary because the paper was very complex. I must say this has made it so much easier. It is really very simple to understand, or it was for me anyway. But thank you very much. So who is leading on this? You are. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So George Sims, Head of Net Zero Homes and Communities at the Combined Authority. As you say, there's a lot of detail in the paper. We feel it's kind of necessary to give people a chance to look at it. But yeah, thanks for your steer on simplifying it. And given time, I'm not going to go through all of this. I think it's just worth bringing out some key points. The slides on the screen. First thing are that timescales on this have been really compressed. There's a real need to try and get the money out to local authorities and housing associations or organisations as quickly as possible. But there have been fairly significant delays. First of all, the general election, which put things on hold for a while, and also the fact that we weren't able to go public with the actual spending quantum until January the 25th, or technically December the 23rd, I think, but that didn't give us much to get things out for January. So we've been quite squeezed, and that's limited our ability to consult. So it's been sort of fairly tricky over the last month or so, but we feel like we've got to a good position now. The other sort of really critical thing, which is very challenging with this, is that the discussions with government are ongoing in relation to the outcomes targets. We hope they'll be concluded this week. Obviously, setting out what the flexibility that our partners have. That's a bit of a challenge. Recommendations to combined authority board set out in the paper. They are to approve the overall approach to fair share allocations and awarding of funds through the pilot. Spending the first chunk of the money, most of which is going to local authorities, housing associations and other eligible public sector organisations, which is project development funding. Consultation with our partners, we felt that it was a two-stage process rather than having a single deadline for applications was important to provide a bit more certainty. And then there's 9.5 million, which is split across combined authority programme management costs and nearly 5 million for regional development initiatives, which are led by the combined authority with local authorities. The recommendation is to approve the Director of Law and Governance to enter into the necessary grant funding agreements. And fourth, it's delegating authority to the Senior Responsible Officer, along with the Executive Director for Strategy, Family and Net Zero, to allocate that funding via expressions of interest. So this is in consultation with the staff team. We've worked out a process that can provide that level of scrutiny that we need, but also allow people to get some the projects. The aims and main aim is funding from government for retrofitting homes and public sector buildings. So those are the main aims. The broad outcomes that we're looking to achieve: reduce fuel poverty and carbon dioxide emissions, and that's where government has statutory targets, which they are also passing on down to us. But it's an area which can achieve a lot of secondary benefits as well, particularly in terms of health, quality of life, skills, business growth. And the really big aim is we've managed to negotiate a more flexible approach to this, so making sure that we retain control of it at the end. So make sure it's a success. That's the sort of the main thing, because this is a pilot in contrast to other areas of the integrated settlement. A couple of things that I wanted to draw out of this in terms of how we're approaching it: collaboration and flexibility where possible, a non-competitive approach to funding, which should provide organisations with greater certainty, being able to shape it around West Midlands priority places. So to Councillor Fenton's comments earlier about participation, we're already testing a net zero neighbourhoods approach. Dudley's a little further ahead, but there will be net zero neighbourhoods in every area, which are built on community engagement and collaboration. And this is a model that we hope will involve more people in decision making and allow people to shape the spend around their needs. But we can only do this across the region if we also look at how we can build longer term investment across the market. Really critical things. The cost of getting to net zero, we estimate that the region is 45 billion. And obviously the government funding, while it's a start, it doesn't get us anywhere near that. So we have to look at where we can bring in further investment, and innovation is part of that. Where's the funding coming from? There's 3 funding streams for the central government funding streams. 2 of them are for housing, so Warm Home Social Housing Fund for social housing, private fuel poor homes are covered by the Warm Homes Local Grant, and then there's a public sector decarbonisation scheme. Now, part of the answer about why is that, the question that we had earlier about the sort of 30 million that Councillor McKee raised, part of the answer is in this, because we took the decision in consultation with our acute hospitals, who've been very successful in previous rounds of funding, not to include them in the devolved scheme. And the reason for this is that the single largest project would have swallowed up the whole of our budget. And so they've been very successful at the national level. We've given them the chance to continue to compete at the national level, and we help them do very well at that. However, what excluding them means is that actually local authorities, particularly academy trusts, other public sector organisations, have a much better chance of getting funding, especially through the allocation approach that we've taken. So that, for Jonathan Kay, probably another thing that's worth bringing out in the report. Where in terms of where the funding is going, most of it is going to local authorities, but a large chunk of the funding is going to housing associations. That reflects that a large chunk of the funding is for social housing, and 45% of our social housing is owned by housing associations, and then there's smaller amounts there which are for those other regional market development initiatives administering the programme, and for other public sector organisations. Given where we are with time, I'll propose that I sort of leave things there for questions.
If I can just ask one question for clarity, because I know Councillor Kettle's going to ask it if I don't, which is, how are you allocating the money between the local authorities? Is that per head, per number of council houses? How is it done?
It's slightly different for each funding stream. So government allocate funding to us based on a fair share of the national pot. So, for example, it's 7.6% of the eligible social housing. So that's social housing with an energy performance certificate of below C is in the West Midlands, and therefore we get 7.6 of the funding, so percent of the funding. And we apply the same approach to each of the local authorities and the housing association. So it's on a pro rata basis. For public sector buildings, it's based on floor space, and for the private sector, funding for fuel poor homes is based on the estimated number of fuel poor homes in each local authority.
Thank you, Chair. And it comes under the obviously we have the net zero neighbourhood, which I think has looked at a couple of times. I suppose just wanted to point to start with is that certainly where the net zero neighbourhood is in Dudley, because it is surrounded by quite heavy industry, it can't ever be a completely net zero neighbourhood. It just isn't feasible because of the transport networks, the level of heavy industry that surrounds this particular housing estate. But I think really what I wanted to find out from you is, I mean, there are a number of lessons I think that were learned from that pilot scheme. So there's some echoing, sorry. There's a number of lessons learned from that pilot scheme. Whilst it would seem really simple to say to private homeowners, actually there's a real opportunity here, it presented a number of difficulties in getting buy-in from the local community. And I know it was a mixed tenure of properties. What are those lessons learned? How are you taking those lessons learned forward? Because that kind of is getting the public really engaged and on board with this was really difficult in Dudley.
Well, it is, and Dudley is not the only example of a sort of good neighbourhood-based approach. I think part of it is making sure that the type of communication that goes out through each neighbourhood is replicated to a certain extent. So it's having a range of different ways of communicating with people. It's a range of different touch points. It's understanding that there's always going to be a range of perspectives within each area. Some people are going to be naturally more motivated, others won't be. But there's also examples. Retrofit Portsmouth Heath in Birmingham is another example of where community organisations have led a lot of the engagement. I think one of the key lessons is you need to involve community organisations in engagement because they understand the needs of people. So that's why one of the regional initiatives that we've got is about funding advice and helping people make good decisions in their own interest by providing the information, but also supporting some of the community organisations to work within their neighbourhoods to give people good advice, help them make sound decisions.
And will some of those community, I mean, just thinking about Dudley, the Dudley model, there really weren't any active community organisations within that particular location, which added to the problems. So where you come, are you going to be, do you envisage there's an opportunity to perhaps engage perhaps more with people might go to, so through libraries, through citizens' advice, through having access at leisure centres, all of those kind of places that community go to, without it being particularly resource intensive from either a local authority side or your side, because I think the Dudley model was quite labour intensive with lots of door knocking, lots of conversations, and you can't replicate that everywhere because of the time spans involved.
Yes, you might not be able to replicate it everywhere, but you can replicate a lot of it. But as to your question, can it be done through other channels? Absolutely. And I think the fact that we're able to align, we'll be giving local authorities 3 pots combined rather than having to bid separately into 3 pots as funding as would have been the case previously. So what a lot of people will be looking at is if there's a school in an area that they're looking to also do housing retrofit, that's another opportunity to engage. If there are libraries, other public sector buildings, it allows you to join all of those things together. So I think it's not kind of down to us to say, because we're putting a lot of the agency to develop projects in the hands of local authorities, which again is a bit different from national schemes, but what we would like to do is be able to share the examples of best practices as we will do with Bubble.
Thank you, Councillor McKee.
Thanks very much. And actually, you can't specify too much, just picking what you're saying about the door knocking there in Dudley, because part of those problems that I was referring to there with Ladywood and Druids Heath, I think if there'd been a lot more consultation with the residents who live there, I don't think there would be so many complaints and issues and protests around that. So, I take a point. You're saying that you've got to make sure you do it, because if you don't do it, it just goes wrong, doesn't it? The 2 points I was going to make, one of which, when I was reading this, from you come in here with trying to have the face of it as the combined authority approach rather than your home council, but I couldn't help read it from my BCC perspective as well. And the first thing I'll be doing there was looking for is a risk assessment to see attached to this. And obviously we don't normally put them with the documents. Just wondering, have we done one? And is it any good? Because obviously just having the document doesn't necessarily mean it's any good. And the other thing I was going to say was just what we were saying on the funding there, and obviously rising to Vera's challenge to make sure we do best scrutiny. When you say there's a cuts or reduction or whatever, because I didn't want to go into it previously, but in the previous one, I think the actual numbers 33.2 million. There'd been a bit of rounding down, and if you run that through the Bank of England calculator in real terms, that's a 38 million cut. So, how much of that comes out of this section here, or is it just too ephemeral to actually put a number on it at that stage? Thanks very much, Chair.
Thanks. On the first point, is there a risk assessment? Yes. Is it any good? It's probably not as good as it will need to be as the project develops, but risk assessments, risk registers are always live documents, so we'll continue to add to it and improve it as the programme goes on. The second question, I'm not sure quite understood. This is in relation to the public sector funding, or?
It was just the point that you made where we were discussing the 30 or 33.2 million earlier, and you were saying part of that reduction is through this, and I was just asking for some numbers that are possible now.
So our initial funding allocation before we talked about excluding hospitals was going to be around 45-50 million. So it's somewhere between 9 and 15 million. So
Are you talking about the original 33? Yeah, that is, so page 39 of the integrated assessment page table and shows the comparison year on year from 24-25 in there. There's about 2 million on the warm home social housing and the warm home local grants out there on.
Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. My question was on the risk assessment, actually, so it was fortuitous that it was brought up beforehand. It is there. I've read it. One of them really stands out to me, and I'm wondering how we're going to actually manage this risk, and that is getting the works done. So it's great that we've got some funding. It's great that we're starting a pilot, but in terms of retrofitting, we know that it's thought, and various different experts have various different opinions on this, that to meet the net zero target by 2020, at least 15 million homes are going to need to be retrofitted before the end of this decade. Well, that gives us 5 years now. You could argue it's still 6 because we're at the very beginning of 2025. And obviously we know we've got a lot of buildings within the combined authority that are going to need retrofitting. So my question comes on, how are we going to manage this risk, given that the capacity within the market for delivery on this is very limited. We are going out with different authorities within the combined authority are all now getting this funding, and they're all going to be competing on a very limited market, along with the rest of England and the rest of the UK. So that's my long-winded question there, trying to explain how I'm coming at it. But it is, how are we actually going to manage that risk?
Thanks, Councillor Fenton. My colleague Ben to my left reminded me that there is an updated version of the risk question. That question, I think, will take potentially longer than the 2 minutes or so that we have. It's a great question, though. There's lots of things that we can do, and there's some things that are beyond our power. And obviously, the closer we get to the end of the decade, the closer we get to 2041 or 2050, that and we're not achieving the sort of rate that we need to in terms of retrofitting homes, the harder it becomes. So when I started this job back in 2021, my estimate was that for the 1.2 million homes in the West Midlands, to get those homes to net zero, based on a 40-hour working week, would require one home to get to net zero every 2 minutes. And so that it is an absolutely astonishingly large challenge. And as you say, if we have lots of grant funding coming in to our local authorities and people go out to tender, the result, as we've seen in the past, tends to be that the supply chain can't mobilise quick enough because funding has been very stop-start to date, and prices go up, quality also suffers. So it's the sort of worst of all things. What I think we can try to do at a regional level is by understanding where the likely demand is going to come, where the sort of skill shortages are. We can work with our skills team to start looking at where those shortages are and how we can start to meet them. I think that another thing is that in terms of retrofitting homes, you've got a choice of doing the really complex, difficult stuff, which takes a long time to get supply chain up to speed on, or you can do some of the lighter touch stuff across probably a larger number of homes, therefore you're spreading the benefits out more widely, but you're maybe doing stuff that isn't so hard to do. And an example of this would be solar panels, where there are previous examples where when the incentives have been right, the supply chain has shown that it can gear up quite quickly and achieve some good efficiencies. This is even the example of the feed-in tariff around 15 years ago, and can mobilise quite quickly and grow quite quickly to meet rising demand. Where it's a lot more complex is over the things like home insulation, particularly solid wall insulation, where you need a much greater understanding. It takes longer to acquire the skills. So part of that is about working with the local authorities to try and understand what they need, but also to try and work out the art of the possible. But ultimately, it is an absolutely enormous challenge, and that is a great question because we don't have all the answers yet.
Great answer as well.
I don't know. Councillor Jamie.
Thank you. So looking at the target numbers of houses we're going to do. So I'll start saying the number of houses, so we've got a set number of houses targeted and a total cost saved. It appears to be buried in an appendix to an appendix in this report. It's in the same bit that the risk question is in.
I couldn't find it either.
So it would be, in terms of going back to the previous point we had about providing effective scrutiny, kind of this is the target number of homes. It probably should have been right in the main report. Leaving that to us at the side. So we've got 5,597 homes targeted. It would be useful to kind of get an idea of the breakdown by local authority. Are we expecting each local authority to do roughly the same based on their funding? So it's 28% of funding, we'll hit 28% of those homes, or is it different by local authority because of the different housing types? But also the energy savings bill targeted of 860,000, or if I understood this correct, 130 million quid onto homes. Seems like a bit, I may have misunderstood where that money's going, but it seems like a little bit of a mismatch. And then there's the other 36 million on the public sector decarbonisation, which is going to the offices.
there's no targets in here for what the public sector money firms are going to on whether it's offices or schools or whatever. So kind of to understand of where we're looking to spend that money would be useful. Thank you.
Thanks. On the outcomes and the targets, as I mentioned, the figures that we're negotiating with government, those negotiations haven't been concluded yet, which is one of the really difficult things in putting all of this together, because what we would like to have done is to be absolutely crystal clear on what those outcomes were, the targets. It's not the normal way that a business case or a program should be written, but it's the nature of the time. The way that we will allocate those targets is exactly as you suggested. If an organisation has 28% of the eligible buildings, they will have 28% of the targets. Now, how they meet those targets, we're hoping to provide as much flexibility as we possibly can. So it could be that an organisation has a minimum number of homes, and therefore they decide to concentrate all the money on those homes and do quite a lot of interventions in each home. An alternative approach would be to do much lighter touch interventions across a larger number of homes, but to achieve the same carbon saving and bill savings targets. So we're allowing quite a lot of flexibility in that. We're hoping to provide more detail once we've completed the outcomes discussions with government. And that's the sort of broad approach that we're taking. And finally, on public sector buildings, about 90% of the homes, 90% of the money is going to local authorities. So that will be council buildings, leisure centres where councils have leisure centres, schools, but the other 10% of the funding is going to other public sector organisations. So it's emergency services, it's non-acute healthcare, FE colleges.
Do you have a target of interventions across that money?
No, not for the number of interventions. The only outcome target we have there is carbon savings.
Thank you. I've got a small number of questions. Do we have a target level that we're trying to get homes to? My understanding is more than 50% of D and below, a minority of C and above by definition. Are we trying to get everybody to C, or are we trying to get everybody to a position where a heat pump will work? What are we trying to do? What's the guidance out there?
We'll be publishing more guidance on this over the next couple of weeks. EPCC is the government target. However, EPCC is not the same as net zero. We have a regional target and local authority targets indeed for net zero. So they're not the same thing. Government's position would be EPCC means a home is no longer classified as fuel poor. Now, statistically, that might be fine, but in reality, it's not the case. And I'll point back to Rockmore again, because we found examples of homes where if you did the EPC certificate, it would say C. In reality, they're really old homes. There might be failed insulation. So there's a mismatch between what something says on paper and what it says in reality. So the answer to, is there a particular standard we're looking to get to? There will be an outcome target in relation to EPCC. So yes, but that's not the be all and end all. We'd like to give people the flexibility to use the money to address priorities in the way that they need to. And that might be fitting heat pumps and getting homes all the way to net zero or net zero ready, or heat pump ready. It might be, again, where you've got a really large number of cold homes, you might be getting homes from a low D to a high D, but that has greater benefit overall in terms of the impact on people's lives, bill savings, carbon savings. So we're trying to leave that door as open as possible to fit with organisational priorities, which might differ. Some will want to go EPCC, some will want to take a different approach.
Thank you. And I think I never did find the number of homes. That was 5,500, was it? 5,597.
Yeah, that was an indicative target.
Yeah.
It will be higher because that's a longer discussion, but it will be higher.
Thank you. And have we tied this strategy in with our adult education strategy?
That's what we need to do more. Yes, absolutely, we will.
Because training installers is going to be really important.
Yeah.
I mean, I personally did my own home. Well, I had a plasterer come in and stick the panels on the walls. I did the carpentry, the plumbing myself. This is one of those solid walls are indeed difficult. If you do them on the inside, I know what you do. If you do them on the outside, I have no idea how it's done. But what I do know is it's lots of different trades. It's almost like kitchen fitters do a bit of everything.
Yeah.
And I've got a feeling this might be the same. That we're going to need multi-skilled people to get out there and do this.
It's the same, but more so, I'd say. I've done it to my own home. The functional strategy, it's worth saying, does set out the links to the other pillars of the integration set, including the skills. So there are lots of overlaps. There are particular skill shortages, but the complexity that you highlighted it speaks to the point around not wanting to push too hard on some of those more complex things, because actually people need to be experienced as well as just having done the training. It's about competency rather than qualification.
That always is, yes. And finally, I noticed we're going to have some advice centres, which I totally, that might be online, of course, rather than a physical centre, but there will be a place you can go. What will that cover? If I, as a homeowner, who's never going to get any money to do this, I'm going to pay for it myself, which, unless we do, this is never going to happen. We might do the social homes, but we're not going to do all the private sector stuff.
No.
And the biggest concern people have got is what I'm getting, A, going to work, B, I'm not getting ripped off, and C, I'm not going to end up with a mortgage company in 5 years' time telling me my house is unmortgageable because there's still these idiots selling spray-on stuff for the inside of roofs. It is a big issue. What are we covering in our advice?
It's a huge issue. As to what we're covering, we think that the advice should cover. We've commissioned an organisation called Sustainable Housing Action Partnership, or SHAP, to do a piece of research which looks at where the gaps are in advice, which there are many, and where we could most effectively spend a relatively modest budget across the region. That needs to be then developed into a proposal to be circulated, agreed with local authorities as well. Government is making moves on planning a national advice service, so we don't want to duplicate that. It's more about filling in the gaps. And as you say, some people will need a lot of advice and support in order to make sensible decisions because it's really complex stuff. But I think there's a need to not only support owner-occupiers who might be willing to pay, but also low-income households who won't be able to benefit from the funding because there simply isn't enough funding to go around. So those, I guess, are going to be the priorities. As to how it actually works, I would think it will be potentially a combination of some sort of centralised resource, which might be sort of phone centres, that's contact centres, but also funding to local community organisations, potentially training for local community organisations as well, to enable them to be the sort of advisors of the communities in which they work.
Have you got time for me to ask a quick question?
Absolutely.
It's a long time. Most of my commercial time was spent actually in the construction industry, but I haven't been in it now for probably about 10 years or so. But there's two questions came out from what you were saying. One of which we used to come across a lot of properties, etc., that really are probably at the end of their natural life, and really the best scenario is just to replace the property, because try and it's a waste of resources almost to try and use those resources to get the best out of it, because you cease to see some terrible construction decisions, exterior pipes coming down the inside of the building, so there's fluid, and if that pipe breaks, and then you're going to try and fill it, anyway, I won't go into that. And then the other one was certainly in those days, new build was massively brick and block. Brick and block was never even getting down to the U values at that stage that was required, where timber frame would quite do it, but the governments at the time were really keen to support the brick and block type of things. They used all the ash and all the other stuff, so it was really helpful for them. But timber frame never really got much of a look in, and so you were already building properties that weren't actually delivering the best levels of heat retention, etc. Do we do anything in this area to try and promote timber frame or other forms that may actually give a better, sort of more insulated, more sustainable form of build?
I think that's a question that's more for the housing policy team. Is for us. This is an area that I used to work in as well. I predominantly work in or exclusively work in retrofit buildings now. But Swedish building regs in the 1970s were better than UK building regs in 2007 when I started in this field. And there's good reasons for that. There's also not necessarily that many good reasons why we can't do better in new build, but that's sort of outside of my professional focus at the moment, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Draw this to a close now. Oh, Councillor Fenton, have you got your hand up?
Yeah, but Chair, if you want to draw it to a close, I can always raise it in another aspect because it's less of a question for who's reporting, I think, and more of a strategic question.
Okay, if we can, because Jaspal has been patiently waiting and his colleague has had to go. So I think we probably should move on to the Q3 performance if we could, Jaspal. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the fourth business plan performance report written for OSE. Biannual reports are provided for Q1 and Q3. So this report looks at Q3 data. The aim of the report is to provide an overview of the monitoring and reporting process for 24-25 annual business plans and to show Q3 performance. It's intended to assure members of the robustness of the performance reporting approach and that the executive board responses to any identified slippages. Before I go into the performance section, I thought it'd be quite worthwhile to kind of convey the actual approach itself so members are aware. So in total, 120 performance indicators are tracked, including 27 key performance indicators that have been identified by the executive board. That information is then reported, the KPIs monthly, and all information, those 120 indicators, quarterly by exception. And that stands alongside Power BI dashboards, and this ensures transparency and enables evidence-based decisions to be made. An upcoming internal audit review will also assess the reliability and accuracy of the performance reporting process. And I'm quite confident that we have a robust process in place. So currently, Q3 statistics and performance is provided through red, amber, and green indicators, or RAG status indicators by exception. And mitigation commentary then to kind of explain if this is amber or red, what is that actual mitigation commentary stating to explain why it is amber or red, to show why is it off track. So Appendix 1 shows the RAG status trend over 3 quarters. And at the end of Q1, 110 indicators were on target, and only 4 were red and amber. When we move into Q2, performance declined to 100 indicators, and I think 15 were red and amber. By Q3, 86 indicators remained on track, and 24 were red and amber. This is kind of expected though, because information is calculated cumulatively. So as we progress through the actual months and quarters, you tend to get more reds and ambers in quarter 3, and obviously within quarter 4 when we start looking at the actual outturn itself. Appendix 2 shows the mitigation commentary, which was something that members had requested in the previous meeting where I presented this information, I believe in July. So Appendix 2 shows 9 PIs and 3 KPIs by exception that may not be fully delivered by the end of the fiscal year. So I've highlighted those for your attention there. So just to summarise, the executive board remains confident in the current approach. having reviewed all the red and amber indicators and agreed on appropriate mitigation. The combination of regular performance reviews and increased visibility through obviously the reports, but the Power BI dashboards that we use enables reporting to be dynamic and responsive, which means it remains a valuable tool for progress and ensuring accountability. Thank you for your time. Any questions?
Councillors? Okay.
So maybe a comment more for the chair. This is obviously the quarter three data. We're now 3 months into quarter four. I recognise that this quarter we have the budget and various other meetings that kind of top priority, but there does seem a bit of a lag. So whether we can in the future look at getting, it's kind of too late to do anything about it now. We've almost finished the next quarter. In the future, whether we look at we can get us on the agenda faster. Yeah, it's kind of the point I want to make. So.
In terms of the information itself, it's reported in arrears. So for example, December information, we kind of start gathering that information in January, for example. And what it meant was, as we were gathering that information, we didn't have the time to kind of fit in with the actual the date being proposed by OSC. I think we had to provide the information by, I think in the first week of January. We were still collecting that information. And also what compounded it somewhat was obviously over the Christmas period, some people were off, so some of the actual commentary around mitigations wasn't up to date as it should have been, just because of that actual Christmas period and people being off. And that made it somewhat problematic to get it in place for that the January period. Hence why it's been provided slightly later than actually envisaged.
Councillor Fenton?
Thank you, Chair. I agree with the last comment on there's not really much that we can do to affect these RAD rankings or decisions that we could possibly put forward. I don't know whether it's for us to comment on, but I think that maybe the reporting system might need to be looked at if scrutiny's expected to be able to make recommendations. That's for other people to decide. But my one question, and there's only one question on this, Chair, comes in on the active travel. And I would like to know why local authorities are having such a hard time spending the money, because a 50% completion rate by the end of the year, and that's allowing for that 50% completion rate to have actually been achieved. And I'm sure we'll find out soon whether it has. I want to know what the mitigating factors are here. Active travel is a high priority for all of us. It's part of the net zero, and it's part of keeping people healthier as well, with better outcomes in life. So what are the factors that are preventing this money from being spent in a timely fashion, and what could the combined authority do to make it easier for local authorities to spend it?
So my role in looking at this information is more about the statistics. Regarding the actual projects themselves, that question would be more for the actual SMEs. So, I mean, I
think Kate might be able to help.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, and this is something that has been discussed within the TDOS committee, because obviously it comes up through our financial reporting and performance reporting. So it is rigorously gone over through in there. In terms of we do some support to local authorities. There is a capacity issue, I think, within cycling itself, in terms of that, of having enough people to be able to work up the schemes. They are quite technical in terms of they have to meet certain requirements. N20, I think, is the requirement to be able to do. So they have to be worked up to the business case standard to be able to do those, and also interact with any other developments that are going on. But certainly we could perhaps bring something back from kind of that angle as well through the other committee where it's just discussed.
regularly.
Thank you, Councillor Bates.
Very quick question, and it might not be for you to answer, I guess, given your focus of work. But looking at the KPIs and the mitigation commentaries, the Thrive at Work and the Thrive into Work programmes are struggling, it would seem. I mean, I know you're going back in history, we had a number of presentations on Thrive into Work. There were always concerns around it, but given the low response rate, at what point is the project reviewed?
Again, I'm guessing that would be for the actual SMEs themselves. I mean, what I would say, I did have conversations with some of the actual Strike colleagues in relation to this, and I know this is Q3 and things can obviously change and move on. And they have come back to me and said, look, this is kind of moving back into the right direction. But I think for some of these questions, it would be good for some of the SMEs to provide some of that contextual information. As you can imagine, there's 120 indicators, and then beneath that, you've got milestones. So you may have up to 350, 400 also projects taking place across the CA, and being able to provide that subject matter expert overview across all that breadth of knowledge would be quite difficult to do. And that's why I think it'd be more apt for those SMEs to provide comment.
Yeah, fair comments, thank you.
Councillor Fenton, have you another question?
Yeah, it's more of a comment really, because this links in with what we were looking at earlier, Councillor Bateman has raised, and that Thrive to Work. So we're looking at why people aren't working. We've got a pot of money there that was designed to help people become more economically active. If how we're making them become economically active doesn't work, it might be possible that actually not just having a report, but having an in-depth look at how that Thrive to Work's working, and what it's actually delivered on outcomes might be a really good idea, and it combines the two, Chair.
My understanding of this report is the comment that you've just made is the purpose of this report. We identify issues that we might want to go and have a dig into. I mean, not dig into. So could we add that as yet another thing we might want to have a look at?
Yeah, sure.
In terms of the structure of the report, one thing I would like is a rolling position, because whilst you say these things tend to deteriorate towards the end of the year, that may or may not be true. The only way you can tell that is by doing a rolling 12-month kind of, I would keep this going and we just actually see whether it is actually getting worse over a longer period of time, or whether it's actually doing what you say, which is it's cycling around a norm. If we could put a rolling, I don't know how you do it, but
I mean, I could look into it and see whether it's actually possible to do something.
I mean, you can to me, you could just literally stick these on the spreadsheet and continue the spreadsheet and put a line of best fit through it. I mean, that would do it. But
so some of the actual the PIs or milestones are yearly bound, for example, and some may not run. So, for example, a capital-based project may be over a number of years, for example.
No, it's about our efficiency at managing projects, and that's what this stuff is about. Are we getting worse or getting better at projects? Are we having more reds over the years or less reds? Ideally, we'll be learning from our mistakes and having less reds. Hopefully not more reds. So it really is just tracking these things over a period of time, which if the earliest data we've got is April 24, that's where we start. And we just add on monthly data thereafter. And that will give us a track on, are we getting any better or are we getting any worse? I see lots of local authority figures that are over 12 months and they don't mean anything, because you can't actually tell whether it's getting worse or getting better. I used to be a quality director at one point in time. I love stats. But I think this meets our needs, this report. I don't know what other people. Yeah. And if there's anything in here that worries us, we can pick it up as an item and then drill into it if we think that is appropriate. and we'll pick up the thriving to work. We've got that listed. Thank you very much, Jasper. Very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
And I think to all intents and purposes, we are now finished because we've really talked about the work programme at the beginning and during the meeting. Our next meeting is Monday, the 19th of May. That will indeed be the work programming meeting. Is it?
No.
There's another one.
Yes, so the work programming meeting that is to be scheduled. There'll be a separate meeting to the 19th of May.
And that will be roughly when? Are we doing that in March, April, or beginning of May?
Said no, yes, we see.
We can get that offline.
Which
Yeah.
the councillors have a view on where they.
I mean, not going too far in advance to it. I think early April would be ideal.
Right. Some people don't care. It's a vote for early April. We might as well do it early April.
April Fool.
Thank you very much for your time, and I'm sorry we wouldn't know.